Our next speaker, Ben Hammersley, is an applied futurist based in Los Angeles. Los Angeles, one of the 4 cities where futurist is acknowledged as a profession. He is a contributing editor to Wired, a presenter of his own Netflix series, Wilderness Medic, a pilot and rescue diver, and he specializes in coexistence with artificial intelligence and the challenges of elite performance in extreme environments. If you find yourself with a question, you know what to do. TNW answers if you've got a question for Ben. But for now, a warm round of applause as we welcome to the stage Ben Hammersley. Good afternoon. Should we try that again? Good afternoon. Thank you very much. My name is Ben Hammersley. I have spoken here many times before, but I've worked for the past few years as a futurist. And a futurist is somebody who is paid to live a few years in the future and then come back and tell you all about it. And one of the things you might not know is that next February, PowerPoint is going to be made a war crime. And so I don't have any slides or anything. You're just going to have to look at me. So close your eyes and think back to 1913. You're in Paris and you're sat in a theater. Just imagine, you're sat in the theater and you're surrounded by the most beautiful people in Paris, the most successful, the most good-looking, the most artistically important people, right there on the verge of World War I. The world is full of political tension, but you are there that evening. You've had a couple of glasses of champagne, and you're waiting for the start of the opening night of a new ballet. It's a ballet written, the music written by Stravinsky. It's called The Rite of Spring. The ballet is being put on by the Ballet Russe, the most famous ballet company in Paris at the time. Choreographed by Nijinsky, the most famous choreographer. Backed by Diaghilev, the most famous producer of theater at the time. This is going to be an amazing evening. No one has heard this music before. Now, The Rite of Spring starts with a dancer in the middle of the stage, naked. I'm not going to do that bit. I might. No. A single solitary clarinet note starts, and the dancer unfolds herself, and the ballet begins. But this ballet music is unlike anything it had ever heard before in that time in May 1913. And as the opening bars started, and the music grew and grew, there was drumming that wasn't quite in the right time. And there were other instruments that didn't feel, to the people in the theater, they didn't feel as if those instruments should be there. And people started to murmur. People started to rustle a little bit in their seats. They started to look around, because behind them, way in the back of the theater, in his private box, was Camille Saint-Saëns, the French composer, who was the old man of French music. And they were looking to see the look on his face, to see if this music was any good. You know, you have to look at the old guy and see, is he smiling, is he frowning? And he was frowning. And as the music built and built, it sounded weirder and weirder and weirder. And suddenly somebody screamed, "No!" Saint-Saëns started banging his walking stick against the edge of his box. A woman ran from the back of the theater all the way to the front, to the orchestra pit, and started bashing her head against the orchestra pit. Somebody stood up, threw a punch. Somebody else stood up, threw another punch. Hats were flying everywhere. Canes were flying everywhere. The dancers were trying to dance. The musicians were trying to play, but the whole thing had turned into a riot. And that evening, in its first ever performance, The Rite of Spring was abandoned within about 20 minutes. The theater was almost burnt down. People don't like new stuff. Now that's a real problem. It's a real problem for everybody in this room because we deal with new stuff. The reason you are here today is to see new stuff. The name of the conference is the next web, right? It's not today's web, it's not yesterday's web, it's the next one. You want to see the new stuff. And so everybody in this room, you're kind of weird. Because most people don't want the new stuff. And yet, we have all been living for the past 40 or 50 years underneath the driving force which has constantly brought us new things. If we skip 50 years on from the beginning of the Rite of Spring, and I'll get back to that story, but 50 years later from that, Gordon Moore, who was the co-founder of Intel, is in his laboratory, and he looks at the sales brochures that Intel made of the integrated circuits, the microchips that they were making. And he realized there was an interesting pattern, that every year, for the same amount of money, they could fit twice as many components onto their microchips. So he wrote this down as a memo, and it was circulated amongst the engineers of Intel. In the early 60s, they were too busy. They were a startup. They didn't pay much attention to it. But in the 70s, when they were bigger, they looked at it again, and they found that the observation was still true. For a certain amount of money, the amount of things they could fit onto a microchip would double every year. It was true in the 70s, it was true in the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. It's true today. And we know this now as Moore's Law, the idea that for a given price, computing power doubles every year. Now, this is extraordinarily odd. We've never had a time in human history where our tools get twice as good as they were the year before. Horses, swords, plows didn't get twice as good every year. Now, there's a reason for this. The reason is we use digital technology to create the next generation of digital technology. You don't use a sword to make another sword. I mean, you use a horse to make another horse. That's true. That's true. But after a while, the horses stop getting any better. And so all of our institutions, our governments, our political philosophies, our sciences, our knowledge of economics, the very basis of our cultures are based around a time, because they come from the past 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years, because they're based on a time where we didn't have this doubling of power every year. Having that doubling of power is very strange. And yet, everybody in this room has fundamentally absorbed the concept of Moore's Law. I mean, you all know it, right? It's the thing that means that Tim Cook can stand on stage like this in September in San Francisco and instantly make the phone in your pocket shit. Because Moore's Law has doubled the capability of the chips inside it. So this has created this intense period of change. Now, that change is so fundamental that we're having to rewrite business textbooks. We have to rethink the way that we plan our economies. We have to rethink the way that politics works. Because there's a rule that is being developed that we've realized is true, that if we ignore a technology today because it's rubbish, it will kill you in 10 years' time. We call this the Kodak mistake. Let me explain. In 1978, Kodak, a company that made photographic film and cameras, they invented the digital camera. It was about this big. It was large. And it could take one photograph that was 0.1 megapixels. So it had the resolution of a chessboard. And it recorded that photograph onto audio cassette tape. Find an old person and ask them what that is. You put the audio cassette tape in, you would take the picture, it would record the image onto the audio cassette tape. That one image would take 7 minutes to load onto the tape. You then take the tape away, put it into the one other machine, it would take 7 minutes to load into that machine, you could see the image. And so when the engineer took that device and they rolled it into the Kodak boardroom, the Kodak board said, yeah, but it's shit, isn't it? And we make Kodachrome, the most beautiful photographic film in the world. Why would we fund this? But that turned out to be one of the biggest mistakes in history, because, sure, in 1978 it wasn't a very good camera. And in 1981 it wasn't a very good camera. In 1984, digital cameras weren't very good at all. In 1988, they weren't very good. In 1992, they were still pretty terrible. In 1996, not very good. In 1997, I become the technology reporter for the Times newspaper in London. And one of the first articles I write is an article that says, digital cameras. In 1998, there were some very expensive digital cameras which rich people took on skiing holidays. They were still terrible. But by 1999, they were getting quite good. The Canon Ixus came out, and it was pretty impressive. And by 2001, digital cameras were great. By 2005, people were stopping using photographic film entirely. In 2008, when the iPhone came out, the first year of the iPhone, with a camera on the back, more photographs were taken with the iPhone than had previously been taken at all in all of human history. On the day that Kodak went bankrupt, having never done digital photography, Instagram was bought by Facebook for $800 million. They had fewer than 10 employees, and their app, as you know, is an app to take pictures to make them look like old Kodak film. And so business people and everybody in this room understands this message. If you see a piece of technology today that might threaten you, but which is still not very good, it will be amazing soon. And then it will kill you. So this has created a whole new world of risk. The most important technology to think about in this way is artificial intelligence. You'll have heard about it many times in the past 2 days. But this year, specifically, is that tipping point where AI has suddenly become incredibly usable and incredibly useful. We not only have self-driving cars, but we now have self-driving trucks. We not only have artificial intelligent lawyers and doctors and appointment secretaries, we have artificial intelligent bankers investing your money. Artificial intelligent, pretty much everything. And yes, some of them are pretty terrible, but the Kodak mistake tells us that even if it's terrible today, it will be amazing soon. And for everyone in this room, that's super cool. It's pretty awesome. The Amazon Echo, the artificial intelligence for your house, I have 4 of them. They're super cool. Siri is my best friend. I have an artificial intelligent lawyer. I have many things. For me and for you guys, AI is awesome. But for people outside, for the normals in the rest of Amsterdam, who you will see when you leave here this evening, they're the ones who are going to be staring at you, slightly scared. This artificial intelligence stuff is incredibly terrifying, as it should be. Because many, many people are going to lose their jobs, many, many people's lives are going to be radically transformed. We've seen this happen before. Every 50 years or so, a new technology comes along that completely destroys the thing that came before it. Around about 1913, when the Rite of Spring was happening, the motor car was completing its disruption. Every major city around the world, 20 years before, had been based on the horse. 20 years later, based on the motor car. And vast industries of horse breeders and blacksmiths and shit shovelers and all of those people, saddle makers, were all disrupted out of business. And today we don't remember any of those trades. 60 years later, when they built the interstate system across America, all of those small towns along Route 66 all went bankrupt overnight. Because that new technology of the motorway destroyed the economy of the Midwest. Because people just drove on through and they didn't stop and they didn't spend their money. Every 50 years we have this revolution happen. But this is the first time that we're aware that it's happening. And that the people in charge of it, the entrepreneurs and the technologists, you guys, you can make a difference by being aware of these fears. As I said earlier, I started reporting on technology and so on in the national press exactly 20 years ago this week. I am very old. Certainly feel it. And so I don't want to tell you about a new technology. You're way ahead of me, but I want to give you two things to take away. Two things to think about for the rest of today and for the rest of the week. The first is a warning. We have seen across the world in the past 2 years some very, very, very scary politics. I'm a pro-European Englishman who lives in America. Believe me, I know about elections. And the root cause of a great deal of that political trouble is the normal people reacting to you guys. You might not think so, but the technologies and the philosophies and the ideas that you guys are thinking about the entire time, that I am thinking about the entire time, are inherently terrifying and scary to the normal people. And they react in funny ways. So I need you to concentrate a little bit for the rest of this afternoon. When you hear all of the speakers, think about how those technologies will impact not just yourselves, not just the United States of hipsters, terribly good-looking ones, I admit, but nevertheless, but how they will be used and abused for the rest of the world, and how they might be used to oppress or damage other people. The social change is important. If your technology is truly world-changing, if you are truly disrupting things, if you are truly to be taken seriously, if you are truly world-changing, if that's what you aspire to be, think about what you're doing. But secondly, you need a tactic to save yourselves. As I said, artificial intelligence and all of these new things are coming along, and they're slowly sweeping through industries, taking up the lower rungs of jobs. And sooner or later, IBM Watson will have a startup entrepreneur package which could run a startup for you. Or a web designer package, or whatever it is. And your positions in the world are also at risk. So how do you deal with that? Well, I believe there is only one way that you can constantly stay ahead of the game. It's a mental technique. We call it constant legacy-free reinvention. And it's very simple. Every few months, you need to think of everything you do as an individual, as a family, as a company, maybe even as a country. Think of everything you do and think, if I was to do this for the first time today, how would I do it? If I was to do this thing I've done 100 times over, if I was to do it for the first time, what technologies would I use? What techniques would I use? What new knowledge would I take advantage of? If you can do that, you'll continually stay ahead of this oncoming transformation. And if you can teach that to the people outside, their fears will go away. Stravinsky, after they'd swept out the theater, after the bruises had gone down, after the ballet dancers had come out of hiding, planned a second performance. And exactly 1 year later, the same people, with the same dancers and the same musicians gathered in the same theater, and they sat down, and the naked dancer stood in the middle of the stage, and the clarinet started, and she started to unfurl herself, and the more dancers came on, and the music rose and soared, and it played, and it played, and it played, and at the end, the entire audience stood up and cheered and gathered the dancers and the musicians and the composer and above their shoulders and walked them down the streets of Paris in triumph. You have a choice with all of the technologies you are creating. You can either create a riot, or you can be carried through the streets of Paris like a hero. Think about how you would rather do the second than the first. Ladies and gentlemen, have a good afternoon.